I ended up being a pretty, hard-edged fisherman, time in jail, selling drugs, but just like the life of what it's like in the high seas.
Welcome to the Invention Stories podcast, where we share stories of inventors who turn their idea into a product. Please visit our website at www.inventionstories.com. And now, from the Invention Stories podcast World Headquarters Studios in Morro Bay, California, is our host, Robert Baer.
Welcome to the Invention Stories podcast. I am your host, Robert Baer, and thank you for listening. You're listening to episode 47, our interview with Bren Smith and GreenWave. Bren Smith is the GreenWave executive director and the owner of Thimble Island Ocean Farm. He's pioneered the development of restoration 3D ocean farming. As a lifelong commercial fisherman, Bren's work has been profiled by CNN, The New Yorker, Bon Appetit, Rolling Stone, National Geographic's Television Future of Food series, The Wall Street Journal, and has been listed among Time Magazine's 25 Best Inventions of 2017. GreenWave is an ocean farmer and fisherman-run organization dedicated to building a new blue-green economy that creates jobs, mitigates climate change, and grows healthy food for local communities. I've lived next to the ocean for about 13 years, and I've listened to two schools of thought. The first is, as a fisherman, we should be allowed to fish anything at any time. And I'm more of a recreational fisherman. I really don't get out there that often, and I don't have a problem with abiding by the rules of catching only the fish allowable at a minimum size. I wouldn't want to eat anything too small anyway. Another school of thought is that the ocean should become a conservation zone and shouldn't be allowed to be fished in at all, which I don't agree with. Now, both of these options seem to have people against it. What I like about GreenWave, it is an option that nobody should be against. In fact, I'm so hyped up about it, I'm looking into it more, and perhaps this will be the first part in a several-part series. I like the idea that I can lease land really cheap and grow seafood in it while helping the environment. I mean, if I want to become a traditional farmer, I got to go buy some land, which I can't afford, and their lives are really hard. And if you've watched any of the Dust Bowl documentaries, well, it's just not an option I'm even considering. But let's get back to it. We have Bren Smith on the line from New Haven, Connecticut. So let's get started. Welcome, Bren, to the Invention Stories podcast. I'd like to ask you a little bit about you as a kid. What kind of kid were you growing up? What were you into? What were your interests?
Yeah, so great to be here. It's a real honor. Honestly, no idea I would have ended up where I am today. I was just like a little hick, selling contongs door to door in Newfoundland and playing with dead seals and, shooting things. That's how I grew up as a kid in a little fishing village called Petty Harbor. And, at age 14, I dropped out of high school and headed up to work on the boats and worked also in Newfoundland in the Grand Banks, Georges Banks, and then in the Bering Sea on the cod and crab boats. So I was just, I ended up being a pretty, hard-edged fisherman, time in jail, selling drugs, but just like the life of what it's like in the high seas, at least back in the 80s.
Wow, I didn't realize that it was that exciting. In fact, I watch a little bit of that, The Deadliest Catch. Wow, so you lived that life, huh? I don't know. It's just I always envisioned it being more boring until I started watching a little bit of that program. Was being a fisherman, was it boring at times, or?
Well, first of all, least deadly. I mean, the Deadliest Catch is like used to work in the crab boats back, and to me, it looks like a bunch of college English majors kind of work. But that's just my bias. It's gotten a lot milder up there. No, I mean, we're the fishermen are the last hunters, gatherers on the globe, chasing fish on the high seas, and it's a really exciting, very adrenaline-filled life. It's sort of you get the humility of being in these gigantic seas. You get the solidarity of being in the belly of a boat for 3 months at a time with a bunch of other people. And I think, but most importantly, is you get a sense of meaning that comes with helping feed your country. And I think that's, as I've looked over my life since the transition into this new climate economy and new food economy, it's been really how to hold on to that for my culture, my community. How do we have jobs with meaning? How do we have jobs that we can still write songs about? Because so many of the jobs that are created these days are just, they're crap jobs without any meaning, just pushing stuff around. That doesn't make you want to get up in the morning. But I will say, so it was exciting being a fisherman. The job I have now, I'm like, it's really low key. I'm like an ocean arugula farmer. And that's a shame, sort of the excitement disappeared. I think that's one of the major things I miss is the transition in the restorative ocean farming.
I just wanted to ask one quick follow-up because you said that you dropped out at 14. Why did you drop out at 14? Did you hate school? Were you dyslexic and had trouble learning, or were you just itching to see the world? Why'd you drop out?
Probably a mix. They didn't have learning tests, so I expect I've got probably 4 or 5 learning disabilities, but who knows? I mean, it was the best thing I ever did in that it was the beginning of living a self-directed life and choosing whether to do stuff and trying to pick my own path. I was a rough and tumble kid. It wasn't like I was doing good in school and getting a lot of fights and stuff like that. So it's clearly not a good fit. Yeah, I wanted to get on the ocean, fish, and study the seas and study the life of fishermen. That was the goal. And it was the right thing to do. I mean, I think it horrified my poor parents. But looking back, it definitely wasn't a mistake.
Okay, yeah, I imagine your parents probably weren't too happy. But let me ask you, because it sounds like you said you grew up in Canada and now you're in Connecticut. What's the biggest difference for you between the two places?
Well, I think Canada in general is just a civilized nation. It's got a rational healthcare system. It invests in people, believes in diversity and environmental policy. It's got, it's a sensible way to organize a society. And my parents are from the U.S. originally, and then they went up to Newfoundland, and that's where I was born and raised. But it's tooth and claw down here, and I don't know if that's working out.
Okay. So how did you go from being a commercial fisherman to, I guess you're what is it called, restorative 3D ocean farming?
Yeah, I mean, so I was up in Alaska, and the trouble was we were pillaging, right, tearing up entire ecosystems with the trawls, chasing fewer and fewer fish further and further out to sea. It was not sustainable. And then the cod stocks crashed in Newfoundland, where I was from, and that was sort of a wake-up call for a lot of us who were younger and really wanted to spend our lives in the ocean. It was clear that these large industrial fleets weren't going to be sustainable. So then I went to the aquaculture farms in northern Canada, salmon farms, and that was supposed to be the solution to overfishing, job creation, things like that. But extremely disillusioned. It was just as bad in new ways. It was essentially Iowa pig farms at sea, polluting local waters, antibiotics, pesticides, terrible tasting fish. And so then I kept searching, and it's really a search for sustainability, but also sort of this journey of ecological redemption in my own life. And I ended up down here in southern New England and remade myself first as an oyster farmer. And that was the beginning of sort of realizing that, we can grow things in the ocean that require zero inputs. So no water, no feed, no fertilizer, and that restore ecosystems. So oysters, for example, filter up to 50 gallons of water a day, pulling nitrogen out of the water column. So realize, there are these restorative sort of technologies that Mother Nature created that we can foster and grow that can really improve our, seas and wall-feeding communities. And so once I started doing the oysters, then just began adding new species and trying out new ways of growing, and ended up, being a 3D ocean farmer, growing a mix of shellfish and seaweeds, and we grow it for good local food, for carbon mitigation, nitrogen removal, as well as animal feed and fertilizers.
I notice you're a nonprofit. Let me start with asking, why did you decide to be a nonprofit?
So I have a farm, which is a for-profit. It's called Thimble Island Ocean Farm. And I've had that for a lot of years, about 15 years, and that's where I sort of spent 15 years experimenting and developing my model of farming. And then I realized, there started to be a lot of interest and people wanted to try out this system. So I created GreenWave, the nonprofit, and GreenWave does 3 things. It trains and educates a new generation of ocean farmers. 2, it does policy work to create a good policy foundation for new industry. And 3rd, research and development, to encourage innovation. So the nonprofit's role was really to train the next generation. We've got a really great mix of new farmers. We've got 11th-generation fishermen out of Rhode Island. We've got Iraq War veterans. We've got a lot of young land-based farmers. So young land-based farmers who can't afford land to farm and buildings and all the expensive capital requirement for land-based farming can come out, and we can get them started with, if they got 20 acres of ocean leash and a boat and $10,000, we can get them going up. The secret to this, economics of this, is sort of like the nail salon model of the sea. It's a really minimal capital requirements, minimal skill requirements, because you set up a farm, it's $25 an acre to lease property, lease the ocean grounds. All you're doing is building a rope scaffolding system underwater, because you don't need much, because you don't really have to fight gravity. And then you put in all these crops that don't require any inputs. The overhead is extremely low, making it just a sort of very sensible economic model and very possible for everyday people like me to get into.
You said you lease part of the ocean. You don't actually have to own like the beach in front of it or anything. How do you go about leasing part of the ocean?
Sure. So we don't own any of the property. What we do is we own the right to grow shellfish and seaweeds in a certain area. So say it's a 10-acre box that we work with the state or the town to create, and we own this sort of process right. So the only thing people can't do on that area is grow shellfish and seaweed. People can boat, swim, kayak, commercially fish, whatever they want on the farm. They just can't grow seaweed and shellfish. So in a way, we own this process right, not a property right, and it's extremely cheap, $25 an acre. And we designed the farm to have a really low aesthetic impact because it's underwater and it's vertical. People can, again, boat, swim, and fish over it. So we're really protecting the commons, inviting people onto our farms, so we're not privatizing, our seas.
That's a little different. I like that. And I used to actually go fishing. I used to live up in Eureka, and then people would always be making these claims that these boats would sit offshore, a couple miles offshore, and I don't know if this is true, but they'd say like Russian or Chinese boats or whatever, and they would have like these nets that were like a mile or 2 miles or 5 miles long or something, and just sort of drag the bottom of the ocean. And that's why there's a need to protect the bottoms of the ocean. Have you ever heard anything like that, or is that just a wives' tale?
That's true. It's really interesting. After World War II, there was all this technology and advance in the naval marine sector, and it was repurposed for industrial fishing. And over time, then over the next decades, it just became more and more efficient, larger and larger scale. So yeah, you have these mile-long trawls that are tearing up entire ecosystems, pulling out all different species, and only having permits for a couple kinds of fish. So everything else that comes up gets thrown back in the ocean dead, right? Mm-hmm. It is the most both unsustainable, inefficient kind of food, collection, production in the world, from my perspective. Those are the boats I used to work on, back when I was a kid.
Wow, okay. I just wondered, but what are the biggest obstacles for you right now? And how do you overcome those obstacles?
So I think one is the hangover that people have around aquaculture. You say aquaculture, it's one of the worst brand names in the grocery store, because people think salmon, tuna, huge pens, lots of pollution, things like that. And we're really taking a different track, right, as you can tell, with a zero input, public spaces, small areas, because we're growing vertically. We don't need to take up a lot of ocean. So we're sort of we've taken the lessons of industrial land-based farming and industrial aquaculture and really tried to do it right, try to do food, try to do farming right, not make the same mistakes. But I think there are a lot of environmental groups and other folks that hear aquaculture and hear that, we're going to go into the ocean and do this stuff, and they want to screech it to a halt. So I think that's one challenge. Now, I will say, once people come out on our farms and really see what we're doing, the change is almost immediate. They just realize, these aren't gigantic polluting pens, right? So I think that's one. Second is, I am worried about what's going to happen as we move out to the ocean. I mean, our climate change is radically changing our food system. Freshwater costs for land-based farmers, increasing prices, fires, and all these things is just driving our food system out to sea. Our wild sources of food in the ocean can't bear that burden because they're already overfished. So society is going to have to get more and more of its food by growing it at sea. And the question is, what's that going to look like? Is that going to be huge corporations growing 1,000-acre farms that are vertically integrated, poor wages, GMOs? Like, is it going to look like that? Or is it going to look like networks of small-scale farms doing network production with seafood hubs and hatcheries based in poor, struggling communities, so there's good jobs, high wages, growing, good, healthy, delicious food? And I think those two models, one's an industrial model and one's a community-based model, is the big question. And I've seen in my work sort of the sharks have showed up. Large parts of Wall Street is showing up because they see huge potential out at sea.
You have your days that are nice and flat and easy to work with, but isn't there like a lot of times it's kind of rough? Does that make it harder to work with when you're trying to get your farm going? Do you need to be able to dive?
Well, I don't even know how to swim. So I think I'm proof enough to dive. I'm a northern fisherman, and most of us don't know how to swim. So don't have to dive. You got to have your sea legs, of course, and you got to have good boating skills. But because we can pick our days, because we're not chasing fish, and we don't have to feed our crops, we can go out in good weather. Right now it's iced over solid. I'm going to be out on the farm with a sledgehammer breaking ice. It's real work, but compared to working in 20, 30-foot seas, it's nothing. We can pick our days.
Yeah, that's a good point. What about like using your technology or your idea and just doing it on land with like simulating a couple of acres of salt water? And is there any way to replicate this on land?
You could. Here's the thing is, why would you? In that the power of this is that it's so cheap to set up one of these farms because you don't need any infrastructure. You don't need saltwater pumps. You don't need concrete tanks. You can just go out in the ocean. The majority of the globe is water. You can set up a farm, and it just becomes really, really affordable and sensible to do. I think that would be the reason, since all those nutrients are out there. It's just it's the sort of easy, and there's plenty of room to do it. And you can scale. This isn't some like little Brooklyn bee farm on a roof somewhere. The World Bank did a study. If you were to take less than 5% of U.S. waters and did restorative ocean farming, you'd create 50 million jobs. You'd create the equivalent protein of 69 trillion hamburgers and remove the amount of carbon put out by 120 million cars. Right? The scale is something that's just 5% of U.S. waters. I think 47 or something percent of U.S. land is agriculture. I forget if that's in the U.S. or globe. But we can scale this and we can do it out in our oceans. It's a really untapped resource, but we have to do it the right way. We have to farm in a restorative way. And here's the other thing. So say we don't do it. There are a lot of people who want to take our oceans and turn them into conservation zones, and I'm all for conservation zones. The trouble is you can set aside the entire ocean as a nature park, and it's all going to die. Right? Climate change, acidification, 1 out of 4 marine species are threatened with extinction. Unless we have a solution to the climate crisis, unless we have our farms breathing life back into these conservation zones, because we're sequestering carbon, nitrogen, outputting oxygen, rebuilding reefs with our farms, that's how we're going to keep our oceans alive. And I think that's the new shift in environmentalism. It's like not just conservation, a sort of Teddy Roosevelt Republican environmentalism. The question is, what are we going to do proactively to address the climate crisis, create jobs, address inequality? So that's a new phase of environmentalism, and I'm sort of proud to be a small part of that puzzle.
Cool, yeah. That's a nice reason to be known. The reason that I learned about GreenWave and I wanted to interview you is because I read Time Magazine's 25 Best Inventions of 2017. So what was it like to learn that you were going to be featured as part of this group?
It's all kind of embarrassing. I'm just a regular guy, and I'm a guy who belongs out on a boat. So, complete honor, very, very surprising, and amazing to be included with that group. I think it is interesting that a lot of folks outside the ocean sector are sort of paying attention to this and interested in what's happening. I think it's resonating in different areas, so that's good. But a huge honor. But I hope a couple of years from now, there are tons of other people that are in this sector that have their own farms, and they're on the list and not me.
Did your website, have you seen a noticeable increase in traffic?
Yeah, mean, we have requests to start farms now in every coastal state in North America and 20 countries around the world. I mean, there's no way there's like a tsunami of interest. A number of people want to support, get involved, become farmers themselves. And so that's just amazing. It's kind of a crisis here because we don't have the capacity and the resources to handle it all. So we have to say no to a lot of people, but hopefully we'll get there.
Sounds like a good problem to have. I'd like to finish up by just asking you what you'd like to see happen in like the next 5 years. What are your goals, or what would you like to see happen?
Sure. So, I mean, we've created what I think of as a GreenWave Reef here in southern New England. 25 farms, a seafood hub, and a couple hatcheries, and then a ring of institutional buyers, Google, restaurants, things like that, and entrepreneurs developing like kelp and mushroom turkeys and fertilizers and things like that out of our products. And that's a GreenWave Reef. And then our goal now, next 5 years, is to replicate that. So create that same reef system in the Pacific Northwest, California. We're probably going to do our first international reef within the next coming year. So I hope to see it. So hopefully we'll have a whole bunch of new farmers producing a whole bunch of new good food, and we get some jobs. And we're showing this is the way to create the new middle class as opposed to pointing fingers and blaming immigrants.
Oh, yeah, you're certainly opening up some new opportunities for people, or you're showing them the potential. Well, Bren, I wanted to thank you for being on the Invention Stories podcast, but I did want to ask one last question, and that is, if someone has an idea for an invention and doesn't know much about the invention process and ask you for advice, what advice would you give them?
I'd say don't try to rush to market too fast. Right? I mean, really try to build it the right way, develop your invention, but build the right structure and team around you. Once you invent something, your next job is to find incredible people, surround yourself with them, so that they can build the organization, the economic models, the structures that are required to enable it to go to scale. I think a lot of us, I did this, come up with a new thing, and then sort of you think it's just going to happen naturally the right way, and it won't naturally. So find good people, surround yourself with them, and then things will go well.
You've been listening to episode 47 of the Invention Stories podcast with Bren Smith and GreenWave. And I would like to thank Bren for being our guest today. More information can be found at www.greenwave.org. If you would like to become a sponsor of the Invention Stories podcast or have a suggestion on how we can make it better, please contact us at inventionstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we invite you to write a positive review for us on iTunes. An easy way to do this is to go to inventionstories.com/review. More information and show notes, along with products you can purchase to support the Invention Stories podcast, can be found at our website, inventionstories.com. Thank you very much for listening today, and please tell a friend.